The second Standard Bank Climate Summit under the theme Journey to Net Zero took place in Johannesburg this week. The event attracted thought leaders and decision makers in the climate space. I'm Moik Peterson, and we're bringing you a mini-series of interviews from the event. In this episode, we speak to Barbara Creecy, South African Minister of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and Kenny Fihla, CEO of Standard Bank Corporate and Investment Banking. Join me now is Minister Barbara Creecy. Minister, thank you so much for having us. Minister, what do you believe is the role of government in enabling the speed of implementation of renewable energy projects?
Well, I think that government is obviously a facilitator and has to create a clear policy environment, as well as giving certainty to the market of the roadmap that we intend to travel as a country. I think that we have been very clear about our commitment to the Paris Agreement. I think that in recent times we have seen a deregulation of the energy market to enable private generation and also to enable municipalities to engage in generation activities. Of course, the Minister of Energy has indicated that he will be revising the Integrated Resource Plan, and I suppose that will be giving greater guidance in due course to the market where we would want to go to, and clearly critical components of that revised integrated resource plan would be, on the one hand, how we would achieve energy security as a country, and on the other hand, how we would of course do that in the context of our climate commitments.
Minister, South Africa has submitted its investment plan for the pledge made at COP26. Should the plan be accepted, how do you think it will enhance energy security in the country?
Well, as I've said, I think that we have made a commitment to significantly increasing the renewable component of our energy mix. This financing is obviously for renewable energy and other activities that would be compatible with reducing the carbon footprint of our country and our manufacturing sector. And I think that this plan will help us to kickstart Eskom's transition process. Fundamental to this transition process is the concept of justice. And what that means is that workers in vulnerable sectors of the economy, and here we would particularly be talking about workers in the coal-fired power plants that are due for decommissioning over the next 10 years, as well as their communities, need to be part of the process of repurposing of those plants, and of course the development and stimulation of new production processes in the Mpumalanga Highveld, so that we are creating alternative sources of employment, but so that we're also dealing with some of our broader development challenges and ensuring we have greater economic inclusion, more job creation, and of course better service delivery.
Now, Minister, I'm glad that you alluded to the coal. How do you foresee SA successfully moving away from its dependence on coal, and will gas be used as a primary energy source?
Well, obviously, we're talking about a transition from coal that would be taking place over the next 25 to 30 years. So it's not something that would be happening overnight. It's got to be a phased process, a planned process, and we have to make sure that there is justice for those who are vulnerable in the coal value chain and in communities that are primarily dependent on coal as a revenue source. I think that it's a little bit early at this point to say exactly what the energy mix would be. Minister Mkhize has indicated he will be revising the IRP. We know that there will be a much greater renewable component. There definitely would need to be gas so that we have protection for peaking. But we are obviously very interested in the green hydrogen sector. We have a lot of opportunities there as a country, and what we've recently seen in places such as Europe, where they are currently facing an energy crisis, is they are indicating that they would be moving with greater speed to looking at green hydrogen as a reliable energy source in the future.
With me now is the CEO of Standard Bank Corporate and Investment Banking, Mr. Kenny Fihla. Sir, welcome and thank you.
No, thank you very much for having me.
Let's get straight into it. Which energy mix would be most appropriate for Africa's energy transition?
I think each country will have to determine its own energy mix, given that the dynamics in the different countries within the continent are not the same. In South Africa, you'll have a different energy mix. If you go to Kenya, because they've got geothermal, their energy mix will be different. But ultimately, every country should seek to have renewable energy as the dominant feature of whatever energy mix that ultimately they agree on.
You guys are involved in a great initiative and program. How is Standard Bank involved in the government's REI Triple P program, and what has been learned from this?
The IPPs have been hugely successful. They demonstrate the power of partnership between government and the private sector. A lot of the initiatives that have been rolled out through operators that are private sector, funded mainly by commercial banks. Government has been able to use this licensing power to crowd in the involvement of the private sector in the rollout of electricity, as well as to crowd in private sector funding to enable that rollout. I think there's something powerful in that. I am pleased that government has also lifted the limit on self-generation, because what that does, it takes the step even further, moving beyond just IPPs into also allowing private companies to self-generate on their own, which will alleviate the pressure on the national grid, as well as allow companies to spend their own money to install electricity provision and generation, and in certain instances to also use that to feed back into the grid. So there's something very powerful and strong about the IPPs, and this is a model that I think should be rolled throughout sub-Saharan Africa.
Allow me to first welcome Mr. Mark Feasel, and he is the Executive Vice President and Chief Commercial Officer at FuelCell. Mr. Feasel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
What decarbonization opportunities do you see on the African continent?
Sure. Well, this morning, Minister Creecy talked about the mix of energy within the power grid. And one thing that we really brought out as an important consideration is that there are both technical and societal reasons in which coal is going to be some part of the mix of the energy grid, especially here in South Africa. And as we think about reducing the carbon content of coal, technology has existed for quite some time to do that, but there has been downsides associated with that. That technology uses a lot of power that could be used to power homes and businesses here within the continent. We are working on some revolutionary technology together with ExxonMobil that will actually create electricity as we decarbonize these coal plants. So we see that as one important thing. A second important thing is that 93% of all Fortune 1000 companies have some kind of goals around ESG. And they look at their facilities around the world and they make decisions in terms of where they're going to grow based upon those facilities' ability to embrace greener energy. So we see an opportunity to go in and work within this continent at those facilities to help them decarbonize those facilities, to allow those Fortune 1000 companies to continue to invest here on the continent.
Now, Mark, your fuel cell platforms have been used successfully in the US. How do you see this technology being adapted for Africa?
Sure, well, we've used this technology in the US, also in Europe and in Asia. So we are entering into the African market right now. One very important consideration that we see is the ability to embrace local labor for scope of work outside of the fuel cell. When we deploy a solution, generally about 50% of the project are things that we can work with local partners. So we see embracing local partnerships as a very important way to bring this technology to market and to ensure that it can be supported correctly into the future.
With regards to producing hydrogen power for Africa, what are some of the challenges and risks?
Sure, we think the production of green hydrogen is going to be extremely important. Here in Africa, you have an abundance of sunshine, you've got great wind in some parts, you have access to water. All those are important elements of creating green hydrogen. So we think some of the things that we can do to de-risk this is, one thing would be a focus on education. Working with universities, working with trade schools to train and equip local engineers and technicians to be able to support this technology, to be able to install this technology, and to ensure that it's operated correctly over time. We also think about some of the work that's going on across all countries of the world right now with respect to hydrogen. So the good news is Africa doesn't have to go it alone with respect to de-risking some of the technologies, because major operations are underway in North America and in Europe to test out some of this technology and to refine it in the next 2, 3, 5 years as some of this hydrogen platforms really begin to proliferate widely.
What is the primary climate risk facing Africa, and do you think this will be adequately addressed at COP27?
I think that the primary risk facing Africa at the moment are physical risks, and that is the increase in extreme weather events that we've been seeing as a result of climate change. Whether or not these will be addressed at COP27 remains to be seen. This COP should be more about implementation of a lot of the decisions that we saw made at COP26 last year. So we're hoping for a lot more in terms of practical application at COP27, and hopefully that'll include better mitigation targets so that we can reduce emissions and hopefully steer the world back into a place where physical climate risk is less of a concern.
Now, Doctor, what are the current challenges facing power energy space that you want to talk about?
Access, particularly in Africa. Depending on what statistics you look at, almost half of Africans don't have access to energy, and that's just got to change. So access is absolutely one of the biggest issues facing the continent at the moment, and once we start seeing a rollout of more renewable energy into that space, I think we can really start solving some of those problems.
Now, some of the challenges bring in opportunities. What do you see as opportunities in the power energy sector?
In terms of power and energy, the renewable space is massive. We've got a huge amount of potential for solar across Africa, wind power as well, geothermal, hydro, pumped hydro. The renewable energy options are really quite endless. So there are a lot of opportunities there. And now it's just about getting the financing in and getting the projects approved and making sure that all the governance is taken care of so that these projects go smoothly and deliver the energy that we so desperately need across the continent.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. Join us again later for more from the Standard Bank Climate Summit.